will determine whether we're able to protect and project the interests of Canada into the world. I came, as the Senator mentioned earlier, Peter and I were colleagues in Central America for a number of years together, chasing the wars down there. And I became a member of the Foreign Service in '67, and it was still in the afterglow of Pearsonian diplomacy, but the agenda was changing in that particular period beyond our ties with the United States and with Europe and into the new world created by decolonization and the self-determination by people. The empires have largely disappeared. They were there very much in place in '45. But in 1945, when sovereign states got together in San Francisco in creating the United Nations, there were only 52 countries. Today, there is 193, and that in itself gives us a magnitude of the issues. And I would suggest to you, the way the world is today, that it will not be long before probably we have 200 sovereign members of the United Nations. But in that sense, I think as an issue that gets overlooked as far as foreign policy is concerned as Canada, I would hope that the committee would note specifically that the Indigenous people of the world, they remain a matter that will increasingly involve our international attention. And it's not one. Canada, along with Australia, New Zealand, and the United States a few years ago, mistakenly opposed a UNGA resolution on Indigenous people. And that, I think, was one of the more serious mistakes that Canada has made diplomatically in recent years. But as Peter mentioned, when I came to Ottawa in the 60s, there was Canada-wide recruitment for the Foreign Service, and public interest was exceptionally high, where it was not uncommon for somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 people would apply for the number of jobs that were available. But today, we're into the age of contract arrangements and entry from other parts of the government, and that in itself, as Peter noted, it carries its own problems. And then equally over this same period, the name changes. We were first external affairs, and then we were foreign affairs, and today we are global affairs. And then the associated functions of trade, immigration and refugees and development were included within that body. Immigration and refugee function has returned to its domestic home, but as you all will note, that those issues associated with immigration and refugees are as much part of foreign policy today as anything else that we want to do. All foreign ministries around the world have undergone similar structural transformations and struggle to find a balance, if you like, in terms of how to meet the needs that those functions require. But the recruitment is still the main issue here, and I'm glad that the committee asked Mr. Beam a number of questions about the report that he was an author of, in terms of how do we recruit and who do we recruit. But in effect, there is in effect a set of characteristics that I think would be essential in terms of Canadian representation in other countries. And of course, this is the question of knowledge. There is aptitude, there is language acquisition abilities, and of course, there's always personal flexibility. And these capabilities, while not necessarily unique to the Foreign Service, are essential for the persons required to provide the services that Canadians need internationally. And of course, there is, of course, as I mentioned, in terms of the personal suitability, you mean the changing Canadian mosaic that we are dealing with. You mean the issue that has come up in any number of my colleagues of dual career families, and in terms of how they can adjust to, in effect, a rotational life in the Foreign Service. But I would also add a cautionary note for you to keep in mind that large international events, including the conflicts that we're dealing with, have a daily, if not an hourly, effect on Canada's diplomatic activity. Today, global communications are faster than the proverbial speeding bullets, and no foreign ministry has the time for reflection before action is often required. But I would also mention as one issue that needs, I think, that should give the committee some caution here, and these are the elections that are going to occur in the United States on November 5. And as we all know, and if we watch the news at all, the political and social divisions in this, our most important relationship, have never been as extreme as they are today. Equally, there are the aspects of this reflected in our own elections and political system. What is unique is that these divisions have an existence.
Ask you to wrap it up in the
Okay,
next
yes, yeah.
20 to 30
And in the
seconds.
United States, no one has been able to do any sort of forecasting as far as what's going to happen on November 5. So it's going to be one of these open agendas that's going to haunt us, I think, for the next 10 months. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pardee. We now open it up to questions from the members. Each member will be provided 3 minutes. Mr. Epp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Canada's presence on the world, and we've had several witnesses come to this committee on this study and testify to our diminished status on the world stage. Certainly, Mr. Neve talked about human rights, advocating for human rights. Our Prime Minister's lecturing of the Italian Prime Minister, our Deputy Prime Minister's tweet of the Saudis, those have all had fallouts. Other witnesses have come, we have to repair and restore our image. So would your recommendations be that Canada further engage in multilateral institutions, or for more on bilateral or minilateral? Or what would be your recommendations on restoring our image so that we are more effective? And perhaps you take issue with the premise of my question, which is Canada's place in the world. If you have comment on that, by all means. So let's start with Mr. Pardee, and then I'll go to Mr. Neve.
I would agree with any comment that relates to the fact that we don't have the status that we had, 40 or 50 years ago. And it's not necessarily what we do in that world. The world has changed so dramatically during that period that the expectations of the rest of the world, in effect, does not necessarily include what Canada has on offer. So whether or not, in effect, we can address that, I think through our staffing means or through where we have embassies. We are tied to a very defined foreign policy matrix. We are an ally of the United States as far as North American defense is concerned, and as far as outer space is concerned. We are a member of NATO, and we are a member of the United Nations in all of its manifestations. So I don't think there's a lot of choices that we can make of either going one way or the other. You've got to do it across the board, and I think most countries try to do this. How much you can do in this kind of an atmosphere with the resource base that we got is the question.
Mr. Neve?
So I too would share the concern that indeed our standing and the things we're achieving concretely as a nation with respect to human rights are not what they once were. And I think an answer to your question is to bilateral, multilateral, what kind of strategies? It's all of the above. And that's why I made the recommendation that we truly do need to get into the habit, and I think it should be mandated by law, to develop an international human rights strategy and action plan and keep it updated. Other countries do that, and that's exactly the approach that gives us the opportunity to make sure that all of the pieces fit together, the multilateral engagement, the bilateral interventions, even the moments of lecturing. I agree that sometimes lecturing can be counterproductive. Other times it's exactly what is needed, including a well-timed tweet, and even when it provokes a negative reaction. But when that's not part of a comprehensive action plan and strategy, I think we risk it being bits and pieces and not having a comprehensive agenda and strategy behind it.
I would love to follow up with more questions, but obviously the time is.
So, MP Alghabra, you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses. Mr. Neves, good to see you. And Mr. Pardee, great to have you here. I will focus my questions to you, Mr. Pardee, because I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about consular services, which I know how passionate you are and how influential you have been in this regard over the years. And because of the limited time, I'll ask two questions at once. The first question is, there's been movement to prescribe a service standard for consular. Yet, you also understand how important it is that consular officials have flexibility in how they pursue each case. How do you balance these two priorities? And the second question is, do you think the consular division has enough resources? Thank you.
Certainly on the service standards, I wrote the first set of service standards for the consular function back in, I think, 1994. I mean, it's still there. It's through various iterations and this sort of thing. And by and large, I think, and I would make the comment, and I follow this area fairly closely. I've been retired 20 years, by the way, and there's been a lot of things that have gone on. And one of the things that I have noticed in following the media is that I think this is one area where the Department of Foreign Affairs or Global Affairs Canada, it has been doing reasonably well, even in a situation such as Gaza, which is as difficult as one can imagine in terms of helping Canadians in difficulty, given the variety of actors and interests that are involved here. But yet, my understanding is that we've got somewhere over 600 and maybe close to 700 Canadians out of Gaza in the last few weeks. So not bad. So there is a system there, and I think on the resourcing side, the problem that you get into are whether or not you need a surge capacity in this area, because for the exceptional ones that come on, we never had a surge capacity, and all we get to do, what we usually do, is to pick and choose. But the thing to remember about consular services, Canadians pay directly for this service. You mean it is paid for by the people who buy a Canadian passport. They spend a $25 fee. The government, when it was that was on a 5-year passport. When the government went to a 10-year passport, it did not increase the fee in accordance with roughly $5 a year, which is what we implemented back in 1996. But as a result of that particular fee, I can tell you that the governments over the years have made money out of this consular fee because the consular services have cost less than the money that was collected through this fee. Yeah.
Thank you. We now go to Mr. Bergeron. You have 3 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour, messieurs.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, gentlemen. Glad to see you again. Mr. Neve, I agree with you on the fact that Canada is really not playing, it's playing underweight, if you will. But most unfortunately, it's at the expense of women, children who are dying in detention camps in Syria. And I certainly hope that Canada will finally decide to act progressively. First question to Mr. Pardee. November last, there was a meeting of the 3 mayors who decided to have Canada work in this strategic zone. At that conference, Canada was questioning itself as to the role in that type of forum. Our discussions in dealing with the superpowers, we have to multiply multilateral relations. And the response from JC was quite interesting. In 2018, you appeared before a committee that greater flexibility should be used to deal with intermediaries to release hostages, for example. Now, the process that the government is organizing